The school bell rang, signaling the start of another year. Students rushed through the hallways, excited to see their friends after a long summer break. The chatter and laughter filled the air as everyone gathered in the classroom, ready to settle into their new seats. But among them was one student who wasn't like the others. She stood at the door, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. Her name was Emma, and she had just moved to town. The other students quickly noticed her as she walked into the room, her eyes lowered to the floor, avoiding anyone's gaze. She wasn't the type to make a grand entrance. In fact, it almost seemed like she was trying to disappear into the background. Her brown hair was neatly tied back into a ponytail, and she wore simple clothes. Nothing flashy or eye-catching. It was clear that Emma wasn't there to make a statement. She just wanted to get through the day without drawing too much attention to herself. As she slowly made her way to an empty desk in the back corner of the room, the other students exchanged curious glances. "Who's the new girl?" someone whispered. "I don't know. She looks so quiet," another person replied. Emma didn't hear them. She was already sitting down, unpacking her books and arranging them neatly on her desk. Her face was calm, but her eyes, those eyes, betrayed her. They were full of uncertainty, as though she didn't know what to expect from her new school. But the students didn't see that. They only saw the girl who didn't speak, the one who preferred to stay quiet. The teacher, Mrs. Davis, walked in and immediately began organizing the classroom. She gave Emma a quick smile and said, "Welcome, Emma. We're glad to have you join us. If you need anything, just let me know." Emma nodded politely but didn't say anything in return. Mrs. Davis moved on with the lesson, but the rest of the class couldn't stop looking at Emma. It wasn't that she was unusual in any way. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance. But in a classroom full of chatty, outgoing students, Emma was an enigma. And whenever there was someone who was different, that difference always seemed to attract attention. As the days passed, Emma kept to herself more and more. She didn't talk much, didn't laugh or joke with anyone. At lunch, she would sit alone at a table by the window, eating quietly, staring out at the trees. She never joined the others in their loud conversations or group activities. It was as if she didn't even want to be noticed. And for most of the students, that was just fine. But some of them couldn't help it. There was something about Emma that seemed off. Her silence wasn't normal. It was almost like she was hiding something, or maybe she was just too shy to fit in. Whatever it was, the others couldn't quite figure it out, and because of that, they began to watch her more closely, whispering behind her back when she wasn't around. At first, it wasn't anything too bad. Just a few jokes here and there, little remarks about her being weird or too quiet. They didn't think it would go anywhere, but Emma never reacted. She didn't stand up for herself, didn't fight back, or even show any sign that she cared. She simply stayed silent, keeping her distance from everyone around her. This, of course, made her an easy target. It wasn't long before the teasing started. Some students would sneak behind her in the hallways, mimicking her slow, careful walk. Others would laugh at her for eating alone at lunch. "Oh look, here comes the silent girl," one of the boys would say, while his friends snickered. But Emma never said a word. She just kept walking, her eyes still fixed on the ground, as if trying to stay invisible. The more she stayed silent, the worse it got. The teasing escalated, but she never reacted. In fact, she seemed completely unaffected. This only encouraged the others to push further, testing her, seeing just how far they could go before she snapped. Emma's days were spent in a lonely silence. She didn't make friends, didn't try to join any groups. The other students continued to gossip about her behind her back, and sometimes they would stare at her, wondering why she was so different. But no one ever bothered to ask her. No one ever tried to understand. And so she became an easy target, a quiet, shy girl who kept to herself, who never stood up for herself, and never gave anyone a reason to stop. But what they didn't know was that Emma's silence wasn't weakness. It was simply the way she chose to live, to keep herself safe in a world that often felt too loud, too overwhelming. They had no idea that this quiet, reserved girl was about to change everything. And when she did, they would be left wondering how they had ever underestimated her in the first place. But for now, Emma stayed in the corner, unnoticed and alone, letting the days pass by one. Little did anyone know, the calm before the storm was already beginning. As the days went by, Emma's routine continued. She would enter the classroom in the morning, sit at her desk in the back corner, and focus on her books. She didn't speak much, only when it was absolutely necessary. When the teacher called on her, she would answer with short, quiet responses. But other than that, Emma stayed out of everyone's way. She was fine with it. The fewer people noticed her, the better. At lunch, she would always sit alone. She didn't mind the silence. It was easier than trying to fit in with the loud groups of students who seemed to effortlessly bond over jokes and shared interests. She had tried to talk to some of them at first, but they always seemed to have their own close-knit circles, leaving Emma feeling like an outsider. She ate in peace, listening to the noise of the cafeteria, watching other students move in and out of conversations, but never once being included. It was better that way, she thought. She didn't want to burden anyone with her company. But as the days passed, the students around her began to notice. There was something about Emma that seemed different, something about her quietness that made her stand out in a way she didn't want. The first few weeks of school had been relatively calm. Students had watched her with curiosity, but no one had really paid much attention. However, that changed as the newness of the school year wore off and the social dynamics began to settle into their usual patterns. And as always, the quieter, more reserved students, like Emma, became easy targets for the louder, more confident ones. It started innocently enough, just a few snickers when Emma passed by in the hallway. Some of the students would whisper to each other, casting quick glances in her direction. "Look at her," one girl would whisper. "She's so weird, just sits by herself all the time." "Yeah," another would reply. "She's like a ghost. Never says anything, never joins in on anything." "What's up with her?" Emma heard the whispers, but she didn't react. She had grown used to being ignored or treated differently. She could handle it. But what started as innocent gossip quickly turned into something worse. It wasn't long before the teasing began. Tyler, one of the more outspoken boys in class, was the first to start. He would make snide remarks about Emma when she walked by, loud enough for her to hear. "Oh, look, here comes the ghost girl," he would say, grinning as his friends laughed. "Maybe she'll scare us with her silence." At first, Emma tried to ignore it. She kept her head down, walking quickly to her next class, hoping that they would eventually get bored. But Tyler wasn't done. He took pleasure in pushing her buttons, knowing that she wouldn't fight back. Every day, the comments became more frequent. "Too quiet to talk to anyone." "Come on, Emma, you don't bite." Tyler teased one morning in the hallway, nudging his friends. "Maybe you'll actually say something today, or are you afraid your voice will break the silence?" The group of students around him laughed, but Emma didn't say a word. She never did. She just walked past them, as quickly as she could, wishing for the moment to be over. It wasn't long before the others in the class started picking up on it. As the bullying escalated, the group grew larger. Emily, a girl who sat near Emma in history class, had joined in. "Isn't it a little weird how she just sits there all the time? She's so stuck up, like she thinks she's better than everyone else," Emily would whisper to her friends. More and more, Emma found herself the subject of their cruel games. A group of girls would make jokes at her expense, loud enough for her to hear. "Doesn't she ever talk?" one would say. "Is she too good for us?" Another would smirk and say, "Maybe she's scared to make friends. What's the point of going to school if you're just going to hide all the time?" Each day, the comments became sharper, more biting. Emma tried to escape them by walking faster, burying herself in her books, but no matter what she did, she couldn't avoid the whispers, the pointed looks, or the harsh words. The teasing wasn't just confined to the hallways anymore. They started targeting her in class. It was clear that they had chosen her as their victim. Tyler would make comments to Emma directly, almost daring her to speak up. "Hey, Emma, what do you think about this? Oh, wait. Forgot. You don't talk, do you?" He laughed as the rest of the class snickered. Even in group projects, when Emma was paired with someone, the group would make subtle comments behind her back. "What a surprise, she's not doing anything." One person would whisper, "Why even bother working with her? She probably doesn't have anything to contribute anyway." Emma stayed silent, but inside, she was beginning to feel the weight of the cruelty. She had always been quiet, but she had never imagined it would be something people would use against her. Every snide remark, every cruel joke, it all piled up, and the silence became harder to bear. She wasn't just ignored now. She was being picked on, and worse, made to feel like she didn't belong. The bullying had become a daily routine. Emma's life at school was now a series of long, drawn-out moments of humiliation and isolation. Every morning when she walked through the school gates, she could feel the weight of the whispers and the stares following her. She no longer tried to block it out. The comments, the laughter, the teasing, it was always there, hanging over her like a dark cloud. At first, she had hoped that it would stop, that maybe the students would get bored or move on to someone else. But that never happened. If anything, it only got worse. The whispers grew louder. The teasing became more public. Tyler and his friends had begun to make sure everyone knew that Emma was their target. And the worst part was, she couldn't escape it. There was nowhere in the school where she could hide. In the cafeteria, as she sat at her usual table by the window, she could feel their eyes on her. Sometimes, they would laugh at her. Sometimes they would make exaggerated gestures as though mocking her every move. And yet, Emma said nothing. She pretended that none of it affected her, but deep down, it was taking a toll. She felt the sting of their words and the weight of their judgments pressing in on her. One afternoon, as she was sitting alone in the cafeteria, eating her lunch in silence, Tyler's voice rang out across the room. "Hey, Emma, is that your lunch, or are you just staring at it because you're too shy to eat?" He burst into laughter, and a few of his friends joined in. Emma didn't look up. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. But that was the moment everything changed. That afternoon, Emma walked into the girls' bathroom to find a quiet moment for herself. She had been trying to hold back the tears all day, and now that she was alone, she couldn't stop them. The tears flowed freely, and she let herself break down for the first time in weeks. She pressed her face into her hands, wishing that the world would just go away, that she could disappear and never come back. She had always been quiet, always kept to herself, but she had never felt this broken before. The loneliness, the constant teasing, it was all too much to bear. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but she couldn't. She wasn't strong enough, or at least she didn't think she was. After what felt like hours, Emma wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and composed herself. She had to get back to class, had to face another day of walking through the hallways like nothing was wrong. But as she stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, something inside her shifted. A spark of anger ignited in her chest, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a victim anymore. She didn't feel weak. She felt something else, something she hadn't felt before. She was tired, tired of hiding, tired of letting them make her feel small. Emma took one last look at herself in the mirror before walking out of the bathroom with a new resolve. She wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to be their punching bag anymore. The next day at lunch, something was different. Tyler and his friends were sitting near her usual spot, as they always did, waiting for the moment when they would strike. They had already begun their usual routine of making fun of her, whispering jokes and laughing as if she wasn't even there. But Emma wasn't going to let them get away with it this time. She picked up her lunch tray, walked over to their table, and stood there for a moment, looking at Tyler with a calm expression. The group fell silent, unsure of what she was going to do. "Hey, Tyler," she said, her voice steady and clear. Tyler raised an eyebrow, looking at her with a smirk. "What's up, Emma? You finally decided to speak." Emma took a deep breath, feeling the anger burn inside her, but she kept her voice controlled. "I've had enough of your jokes. You think it's funny to make fun of me, don't you? You think it makes you look cool." She paused, watching his face change from smug to confused. "Well, it doesn't. It just makes you look pathetic." The group went silent, the laughter that usually followed their jokes fading into uncomfortable stillness. Tyler opened his mouth to speak, but Emma didn't give him the chance. "I'm done with this. I'm not going to sit here and let you make me feel small anymore. You think I'm weak because I don't fight back, but you're wrong. I don't have to fight you to win. I'm stronger than you think." For a long moment, Tyler said nothing. His friends glanced at each other, unsure of what to do. But Emma wasn't done. She took a step back, looking around the cafeteria. "And for everyone else sitting here, laughing and watching like it's a game, let me remind you, I'm not the problem. You are. I'm not the one who's too scared to say anything. I'm not the one hiding behind a joke." She turned on her heel, walking away with her head held high, leaving the group in stunned silence. Her heart was pounding, but she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: pride. From that day forward, things began to change. The bullying didn't stop overnight, but Emma's newfound courage had shifted something. Tyler and his friends didn't know how to handle her now. They had expected her to keep hiding, to keep taking the abuse, but they weren't prepared for her to stand up for herself. They didn't know what to do when she stopped being the quiet, invisible girl they could pick on. Emma still kept to herself for the most part, but now when the teasing started, she spoke up. She didn't let it slide. She didn't let them control her with their words. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the weight of their laughter made her want to shrink back into the shadows. But every time she stood up for herself, it became a little easier. Emma's life began to shift in ways she never thought possible. Standing up to Tyler and his friends was the beginning of something she had been searching for without even realizing it: her voice. She had always kept it quiet, hidden behind the walls of her own thoughts, believing that silence was her only defense. But after that day in the cafeteria, Emma discovered that silence could only protect her for so long. To truly protect herself, she had to speak out. She had to stand tall, not just physically but emotionally as well. The days following that lunch incident were filled with a strange sense of anticipation. Emma didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if Tyler and his friends would retaliate or if the others would continue to whisper behind her back. But one thing she did know: she was done being the victim. She wasn't going to let anyone push her around anymore. At first, the changes were subtle. The teasing didn't stop right away. Tyler, although surprised by her response, didn't back down immediately. He continued to make occasional comments, trying to provoke her, but Emma didn't flinch. Whenever he said something, she looked at him directly, her expression calm, her eyes unwavering. Sometimes she would simply shrug or shake her head, as if his words didn't matter to her. And little by little, Tyler started to notice that his usual tricks weren't working anymore. What made it even more surprising to the other students was Emma's sudden confidence. She was no longer the shy, withdrawn girl who stayed in the background. She had begun to engage in small conversations, even if it was just to say hello to a few classmates or ask a simple question in class. She wasn't outgoing, far from it, but she wasn't retreating into herself either. She had learned that she didn't need to be loud or center of attention to stand her ground. She simply needed to be herself, to stop letting others define her. One afternoon, during a group project in science class, Emma was paired with two students who had always kept their distance from her. At first, they seemed unsure of how to approach her. They had seen what had been happening with Tyler and his friends, and they were likely hesitant about working with someone who had been the subject of so much bullying. But Emma didn't let the awkwardness hang in the air. She started the conversation herself. "Hey," Emma said, her voice steady but friendly. "I think we should start by dividing up the work. I'll take the research part if you want to focus on the presentation." She smiled at them, offering a simple, non-threatening suggestion. At first, the two students exchanged a glance, almost like they were waiting for Emma to say something strange, waiting for her to retreat into the background. But when she didn't, they hesitated for only a second before agreeing. "Yeah, sure. Sounds good," one of them said, a little surprised. From that point on, Emma engaged more and more with her classmates. She wasn't the loudest, but she started to contribute more in group settings. She found that her thoughts were valuable, that she had ideas that could help others. And, surprisingly, the students who had once avoided her began to treat her differently. They saw her as someone who could be counted on, someone who had something to offer. However, it wasn't just her classmates who noticed the change. The teachers began to see Emma in a new light as well. Before, she had been the quiet, almost invisible student who blended into the background, never causing trouble, but also never shining in any way. But now she was becoming more engaged in class discussions. Her work was more consistent, her contributions thoughtful. Mrs. Harper, the English teacher, had even commented on it one day after class. "Emma," Mrs. Harper said, pulling her aside as the other students filed out of the room. "I've noticed something about you recently. You've really started to speak up in class. Your thoughts are always so insightful. I'm glad to see you're more comfortable sharing them." Emma smiled softly. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. I've been trying." "You should be proud of yourself," Mrs. Harper added kindly. "You have a lot to offer, and I'm happy to see you embracing it." As the weeks passed, Emma's transformation was undeniable. The quiet, reserved girl who once walked through the hallways with her head down, avoiding eye contact, had slowly but surely found her place. She had become someone more confident, more willing to face the world head-on, no longer hiding behind the walls of silence that once protected her. The teasing had lost its sting, and the whispers had turned into something else: respect. But while Emma had begun to heal, there was still something lingering beneath the surface. The bullying, while less frequent, hadn't completely stopped. It was quieter now, like an uncomfortable tension in the air that Emma couldn't fully escape from. The real test was coming. How far would the students, especially Tyler, let her go before they tried to pull her back into the shadows? One chilly October morning, Emma was walking to her first class when she overheard a conversation between some of the popular girls in the hallway. They were talking about her. "She's really starting to act like she owns the place, don't you think?" Emily said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Emma froze, a cold chill creeping down her spine. She had heard this kind of talk before. They were talking about her, about how she was acting different, as if the fact that she wasn't shrinking back into the background was something to be mocked. "She thinks she's better than everyone else now, huh?" Another girl added. "Did you see how she handled Tyler the other day? I didn't know she had it in her." "Yeah," Emily scoffed. "Maybe she thinks she's so special just because she stood up for herself. It's not like she's done anything impressive." Emma's stomach twisted, but she didn't let it show. She kept walking, her head held high, despite the bitterness she felt rising in her chest. It wasn't enough for them to see her stand up for herself and respect her for it. Instead, they still wanted to tear her down, to remind her that no matter how much she changed, she would never truly belong. She could feel their eyes on her as she walked past them. They watched her like they were trying to find something wrong with her, something to criticize. For a moment, Emma wanted to shrink back into herself, to hide from the judgment that still followed her. But then she remembered something important, something that had been growing inside her since she first stood up to Tyler. She had earned her place in this world. She wasn't going to let anyone, not even these girls, make her feel small again. That afternoon, Emma found herself in the library during lunch, sitting at her usual spot by the window. She had learned that the best way to recharge and collect her thoughts was to escape into the peaceful world of books. But today, as she opened her history book, her mind kept drifting back to the conversation she had overheard. She couldn't understand why they were still so obsessed with her. She had never asked for their approval, never sought to change who she was for anyone. Why couldn't they just leave her alone? "Why do you care so much about what they think?" a voice inside her asked. It was a voice she hadn't heard much before, the voice of someone who was learning to embrace herself, flaws and all. She closed the book and leaned back in her chair, staring out at the falling leaves outside. Emma had been battling with her self-doubt for years, but the more she stood up for herself, the more she realized that no one else's opinion could define her. It was about time she truly believed that. But she didn't realize just how much that belief would be tested in the coming days. The next week, Tyler approached her again. It wasn't in the way she expected. This time, he didn't try to provoke her with cruel jokes or loud taunts. He seemed different, quieter, more calculating. It happened after class when Emma was gathering her things from her locker. She didn't notice him at first, but when she closed her locker door, she found him standing just a few feet away. He didn't look like his usual self, the arrogant, mocking figure she had grown used to. Instead, he seemed almost serious. "Emma," Tyler said, his voice low, as though choosing his words carefully. Emma didn't know how to react. She had spent so many days avoiding him and his group that the idea of him speaking to her now felt strange, unsettling. But instead of turning away, she stood her ground. "What do you want, Tyler?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. She had no idea if this was another trick or if he was genuinely trying to make peace. "I just wanted to say something," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I know I've been a jerk to you, and I don't know why I thought it was funny. I guess I just thought it would make me look cool, you know." Emma was taken aback. This wasn't the Tyler she had expected. She thought he would lash out, continue to mock her. Instead, he seemed vulnerable, almost human. "I didn't want to be the guy who picked on the quiet girl, but I guess that's what I ended up being. I'm sorry for that." He looked at her for a long moment, waiting for her reaction. Emma stood frozen, unsure of what to say. She had never imagined that Tyler would apologize. But at the same time, she couldn't forget the years of teasing, the cruel words, the constant mocking. She had built up a wall around herself because of everything he had done. "I don't need your apology, Tyler," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I don't need anyone's apology for who I am or how I choose to live my life. But I appreciate that you're acknowledging what you did." Tyler nodded, looking down at the floor, clearly uncertain of how to continue. For a moment, the silence between them was heavy, but then he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "I get it. I'm not asking for your forgiveness or anything. I just wanted you to know that I realize I messed up, and I won't bother you anymore. I mean it." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing in the hallway, still processing the unexpected encounter. The weeks that followed Tyler's unexpected apology were a mix of emotions for Emma. She had been skeptical about the idea of things changing overnight, but she couldn't ignore that something had shifted, both inside her and in the way others saw her. Tyler's apology wasn't a magic fix. She still faced whispers, sideways glances, and occasional teasing, but it was a sign that things were different now. She wasn't the quiet girl who took it all anymore. And for the first time, she wasn't alone in her fight. Emma spent most of her time focused on herself, learning to love her own company, excelling in her studies, and embracing her newfound confidence. But something else was happening too. The more she opened up and stood her ground, the more she found herself surrounded by a small, unexpected group of people who were starting to respect her. At first, she hadn't noticed it. But one day, as she sat at her usual table in the cafeteria, something dawned on her. It was during lunch when Rachel, a girl from her history class, who had never spoken to Emma before, walked up to her. Emma looked up in surprise. "Hey," Rachel said with a tentative smile. "Mind if I sit here?" Emma blinked, surprised by the question. In the past, Rachel had always been part of the larger popular group, and they never really interacted. But now, here she was, offering to sit with her. "Sure," Emma replied, a little unsure but smiling back. Rachel sat down across from her, and they spent the next few minutes in an awkward silence. But it wasn't long before Rachel spoke again. "I noticed something," she began slowly. "You've changed lately. You used to always keep to yourself, but now, you seem different. It's like you're not afraid anymore." Emma paused, considering her words carefully. She had spent so long trying to hide from people, trying to keep herself invisible, that she hadn't realized how much her silence had defined her. But Rachel had noticed, and that made her realize how much her actions had been seen, even if she hadn't been aware of it. "I guess I just realized I didn't need to hide anymore," Emma said softly. "I've been hiding for so long, thinking it would make everything easier. But it didn't. It just made things worse." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "I get that. I know I've never really talked to you before, but I've seen what they did to you, how they treated you. It wasn't right." Emma felt a surge of emotion, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She had never expected anyone to speak up, let alone someone like Rachel, who had always been on the outskirts of the popular group. But here she was, not only acknowledging what Emma had gone through, but also offering her a place. From that day forward, Rachel became a constant in Emma's life. The two girls began talking more, discovering that they had more in common than they thought. Rachel wasn't exactly a social butterfly either, but she had always been a quiet observer, much like Emma. And as they spent more time together, Emma began to realize that there were other people in the school who, just like her, were tired of pretending and wanted to find real connections. It wasn't long before Rachel introduced Emma to a few other classmates who had also experienced their own form of isolation. There was Maya, a girl who had been a target of bullying because of her cultural background, and Sam, a quiet, artistic boy who had always kept to himself because he didn't fit in with the stereotypical cool crowd. They all gravitated toward Emma, not because she was now some kind of social outcast turned hero, but because they saw in her something they could relate to: strength, resilience, and a willingness to embrace who they were, flaws and all. And so, Emma's tribe began to grow. Slowly but surely, the small group of misfits became a tight-knit unit. They weren't popular, and they didn't care to be. They didn't fit into the mold of what everyone else expected, but they didn't need to. They accepted each other for who they were, and that acceptance made all the difference. They spent their lunches together, chatting about everything from books to music to their personal struggles. Emma was no longer the isolated girl who spent her days in silence. She was part of something real, something that felt genuine. And for the first time, she didn't feel alone in the world. The weeks that followed Tyler's unexpected apology were a mix of emotions for Emma. She had been skeptical about the idea of things changing overnight, but she couldn't ignore that something had shifted, both inside her and in the way others saw her. Tyler's apology wasn't a magic fix. She still faced whispers, sideways glances, and occasional teasing, but it was a sign that things were different now. She wasn't the quiet girl who took it all anymore, and for the first time, she wasn't alone in her fight. Emma spent most of her time focused on herself, learning to love her own company, excelling in her studies, and embracing her newfound confidence. But something else was happening too. The more she opened up and stood her ground, the more she found herself surrounded by a small, unexpected group of people who were starting to respect her. At first, she hadn't noticed it, but one day, as she sat at her usual table in the cafeteria, something dawned on her. It was during lunch when Rachel, a girl from her history class who had never spoken to Emma before, walked up to her. Emma looked up in surprise. "Hey," Rachel said with a tentative smile. "Mind if I sit here?" Emma blinked, surprised by the question. In the past, Rachel had always been part of the larger popular group, and they never really interacted. But now, here she was, offering to sit with her. "Sure," Emma replied, a little unsure but smiling back. Rachel sat down across from her, and they spent the next few minutes in an awkward silence. But it wasn't long before Rachel spoke again. "I noticed something," she began slowly. "You've changed lately. You used to always keep to yourself, but now, you seem different. It's like you're not afraid anymore." Emma paused, considering her words carefully. She had spent so long trying to hide from people, trying to keep herself invisible, that she hadn't realized how much her silence had defined her. But Rachel had noticed, and that made her realize how much her actions had been seen, even if she hadn't been aware of it. "I guess I just realized I didn't need to hide anymore," Emma said softly. "I've been hiding for so long, thinking it would make everything easier. But it didn't. It just made things worse." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "I get that. I know I've never really talked to you before, but I've seen what they did to you, how they treated you. It wasn't right." Emma felt a surge of emotion, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She had never expected anyone to speak up, let alone someone like Rachel, who had always been on the outskirts of the popular group. But here she was, not only acknowledging what Emma had gone through, but also offering her a place. From that day forward, Rachel became a constant in Emma's life. The two girls began talking more, discovering that they had more in common than they thought. Rachel wasn't exactly a social butterfly either, but she had always been a quiet observer, much like Emma. And as they spent more time together, Emma began to realize that there were other people in the school who, just like her, were tired of pretending and wanted to find real connections. It wasn't long before Rachel introduced Emma to a few other classmates who had also experienced their own form of isolation. There was Maya, a girl who had been a target of bullying because of her cultural background, and Sam, a quiet, artistic boy who had always kept to himself because he didn't fit in with the stereotypical cool crowd. They all gravitated toward Emma, not because she was now some kind of social outcast turned hero, but because they saw in her something they could relate to: strength, resilience, and a willingness to embrace who they were, flaws and all. And so, Emma's tribe began to grow. Slowly, but surely, the small group of misfits became a tight-knit unit. They weren't popular, and they didn't care to be. They didn't fit into the mold of what everyone else expected, but they didn't need to. They accepted each other for who they were, and that acceptance made all the difference. They spent their lunches together, chatting about everything from books to music to their personal struggles. Emma was no longer the isolated girl who spent her days in silence. She was part of something real, something that felt genuine. And for the first time, she didn't feel alone in the world. As the school year drew to a close, Emma felt a sense of change that was deeper than just the physical transitions of the classroom and the calendar. She could sense that she wasn't the same person who had walked through these hallways at the beginning of the year. That girl, the quiet, shy, and isolated version of herself, felt like a distant memory. But in the best way possible, she realized she was no longer defined by her past. She was no longer bound by the expectations of others. Emma's group of friends had become her sanctuary, a place where she could truly be herself without fear of judgment. Maya, Sam, Rachel, and even a few others who had joined their circle had shown her the true meaning of acceptance. They didn't expect her to be perfect or to fit into any mold. They didn't care about her social standing, how much money she had, or whether she was the most outgoing person in the room. What mattered was who she was on the inside, and that was something they all had in common. One afternoon, as the weather started to warm up, the group decided to spend the afternoon at the local park. It was one of the first truly sunny days of spring, and Emma couldn't remember the last time she had spent such a carefree afternoon. They all sat on the grass, sharing snacks, talking about the upcoming summer, and laughing about random moments from their time at school. There were no pretenses, no social games, just genuine friendship. "I can't believe this year is almost over," Maya said, lying back on the grass and gazing up at the sky. It feels like just yesterday we were all figuring out who we were. Rachel nodded, a soft smile on her face. It's crazy how much can change in such a short amount of time. I mean, look at Emma. You're a completely different person than when I first met you. Emma's heart swelled. It had taken so long to get here, this place where she could look back and not feel like she had failed, but instead feel proud of her journey. It feels strange, honestly, she said, sitting cross-legged on the grass. I feel like I shed a lot of old skin, like I'm someone new. But also, someone I've always been. I just never let myself be her before. There was a silence for a moment, and then Sam spoke, his voice quieter than the others. I know what you mean. I used to hide who I was too. But after meeting you guys, I realized that I didn't need to keep pretending. I'm just me. And that's enough. The warmth Emma felt inside as she heard these words made her feel like the final pieces of her transformation had fallen into place. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all of them. About finding strength not only in who they were but in each other. They had helped each other heal. And in doing so, they had formed something stronger than friendship. They had created a support system, a true bond. But Emma still had one more hurdle to face, one final test that would truly prove how far she had come. It came in the form of an unexpected invitation, something she had never in a million years imagined would happen. It was just a few days before the end of the school year when Emma was walking to her last class of the day. As she passed by a group of students from the popular crowd, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. Emma. Emily's voice rang out from behind her. Emma stopped in her tracks, surprised to hear Emily calling out to her. She hadn't spoken to Emily since their encounter in the cafeteria months ago. Her heart began to race slightly, unsure of what this interaction would bring. She had no idea what to expect. Turning around, she saw Emily standing with her friends, who were watching her closely. But this time, there was something different about the way Emily stood. She wasn't mocking Emma, nor did she look smug or condescending. There was a softness in her expression that Emma couldn't quite place. "Hey, can we talk?" Emily asked, her voice calmer than Emma had expected. For a moment, Emma hesitated. What did Emily want now? She had spent so long avoiding her, trying to put that part of her life behind her. But there was something in Emily's tone that made Emma decide to listen. "Sure," Emma said cautiously, taking a few steps toward her. The other students dispersed a little, giving them some space. Emily stood there for a moment, seemingly unsure of how to begin. Then she took a deep breath and spoke. "I just wanted to say, I've been thinking about how I treated you, and I was wrong. I made fun of you, made you feel like you didn't belong. And that wasn't right." Emily's words were slow, deliberate, but there was sincerity in them. "I guess I didn't understand what it was like to be in your shoes." Emma stood still, processing what Emily was saying. She had never expected an apology from someone like Emily. It felt surreal to hear her acknowledge her past behavior so openly. "I'm sorry," Emily continued, looking down at her feet for a moment. "You didn't deserve any of that. And I was a bully. I don't know why I thought it was funny. I've realized now that it wasn't." Emma's heart beat faster, not from anger, but from something else. Relief. She had spent so much time holding on to the hurt that Emily had caused her. But now, hearing these words, she realized that it wasn't about holding on to that pain anymore. It was about letting go and moving forward. "I appreciate you saying that," Emma replied, her voice steady. "But honestly, I've moved on. I'm not the same person I was before. And I think you've changed too. We all have." Emily nodded, a small smile forming on her face. "Yeah, I guess we have." There was a brief pause before Emily added, "So, I was thinking, maybe we could start over. Not be best friends or anything, but just, start fresh. No hard feelings." Emma stood there for a moment, considering. She hadn't expected this kind of offer. After everything that had happened, the last thing she thought she'd be doing was starting over with Emily. But what Emily had said about change, about growth, made Emma realize that sometimes forgiving wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about moving forward. Yeah, Emma said finally, a small but genuine smile crossing her face. Starting fresh sounds good. With that, Emily smiled too. A real smile this time. Thanks. I'm glad we talked. As they parted ways, Emma felt something settle inside her. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about understanding that people could change, and sometimes they did.